When millions of people started working from home, something strange happened. Some jobs kept producing value almost immediately. Others suddenly became harder to explain. Without the office, without the hallway conversations, without the meetings, without the rituals of being seen, a lot of work started to look different, cleaner, more direct, or strangely unnecessary. That is when many people noticed something uncomfortable. Some roles seemed to depend less on creating value and more on being physically surrounded by the appearance of work. Because the office does something powerful. It turns activity into evidence. It turns presence into legitimacy. It turns coordination into importance. It turns meetings into work almost by default. And as long as everyone is inside the building, that illusion can be hard to question. But once work moved home, some parts of the system translated perfectly. Other parts suddenly looked like static. That is why remote work triggered such a strong reaction. It did not just change where people worked. It changed what work looked like when stripped of office theater. So what exactly did remote work expose? Productivity? Or the fact that some modern jobs only made sense inside the rituals, visibility, and hierarchy of the office? The uncomfortable answer is this. Remote work did not create fake jobs. It exposed how much of modern employment had become built around looking necessary inside a system that often confused activity with value. For a long time, the office did more than gather people in one place. It gave work a stage. If you were in meetings, answering quickly, moving between rooms, talking to managers, updating decks, joining check-ins, and appearing busy, your role felt real. Not necessarily because the output was always clear, but because the office environment made the process feel substantial. This matters more than people admit, because a huge amount of modern work is hard to measure directly. Not impossible to measure, but easy to blur. And once work becomes blurry, organizations start relying on proxies. Presence becomes one proxy, responsiveness becomes another, calendar density becomes another. Managerial visibility becomes another. Speaking in the room becomes another. In an office, those proxies feel natural. You can see the person, hear the conversation, watch the activity, sense the movement, and that sensory environment gives a lot of roles a kind of automatic legitimacy. The problem is that legitimacy is not the same as value. It just feels close to value when everyone is physically there to perform it together. When work moved home, something important disappeared. Not work itself, the stage around it. Suddenly, people were no longer surrounded by the physical cues that made activity feel meaningful. There was no commute signaling seriousness, no conference room signaling importance, no quick manager walk-by signaling supervision, no office buzz making movement feel productive. And once those cues vanished, the underlying logic of many jobs became easier to examine. What exactly is this person producing? What changes because this role exists? Would the work still happen without all these check-ins, summaries, alignment calls, and management layers? For some roles, the answers were obvious. Engineers still shipped, designers still designed, writers still wrote, analysts still analyzed, support teams still solved problems, operators still operated. But other roles felt less stable once their environment changed, because their function depended heavily on being embedded in office structure, not necessarily to create clear output, but to supervise, monitor, circulate information, escalate visibility, or maintain layers of coordination that made more sense inside a physical organization than in a lean remote workflow. That does not mean every one of those roles was useless. It means remote work made the difference between direct output and organizational maintenance much harder to ignore. One of the clearest things remote work exposed is that not all jobs relate to value in the same way. Some jobs create things, some jobs fix things, some jobs move things, some jobs directly solve a problem that would exist whether the office was there or not. But other jobs sit further from the point of creation. They schedule, monitor, translate, summarize, track, present, escalate, review, coordinate the coordination. Again, that does not automatically make them fake. The real issue is what happens when too many layers build up between the work and the people discussing the work. At that point, the organization starts producing labor around labor, work about work, reporting about reporting, meetings about meetings, visibility about progress instead of progress itself. Inside an office, this can feel normal because the institution is physically reinforcing its own importance all day long. But remotely, those layers become more visible. If the team can function without 3 update meetings, why were they there? If output improves with fewer interruptions, what were those interruptions accomplishing? If people finish faster without constant supervision, what exactly was being managed before? These questions made a lot of people uncomfortable because they did not just challenge workflows. They challenged status. This is where the subject becomes controversial, because some of the strongest resistance to remote work was never just about collaboration. It was about visibility. A lot of managers were trained inside systems where being able to see work happening felt inseparable from leading it. But seeing work is not the same as enabling it. And once people worked remotely, many managers lost their most familiar tools of psychological control. Walking by, checking body language, counting presence, calling spontaneous meetings, interpreting busyness as engagement. Without those tools, some leaders had to confront a difficult possibility. Maybe parts of their role had become dependent on managing atmosphere more than outcomes. Maybe some supervision existed because the office made supervision easy, not because the work truly required that much intervention. Maybe entire layers of organizational life had grown around the need to watch, signal, align, and justify. Not always because value demanded it, but because hierarchy did. This is why remote work felt threatening to certain kinds of management. It did not just decentralize work, it exposed how much of managerial legitimacy depended on proximity. And once proximity disappeared, some people had to prove value in a more direct way than they were used to. Not everyone liked that. One of the reasons this topic causes so much tension is because offices are excellent at making low-value work look serious. A person walking quickly with a laptop looks important. A packed calendar looks important. A room full of people discussing alignment looks important. A carefully formatted presentation looks important. Constant updates feel important, and sometimes they are. But offices blur the difference between something being visible and something being valuable. That is their hidden power. They create a constant atmosphere of institutional motion. Inside that atmosphere, it becomes easier for unnecessary layers to survive. Remote work weakened that illusion. Because distance forces a harsher question: what remains when the room disappears? The reason conversations about fake jobs become so emotional is that they are never just about efficiency. They are about identity. A job is not only income, it is status, routine, self-respect, professional meaning, a way of explaining yourself to the world. So when remote work seemed to expose that some roles were less essential than people believed, the reaction was bound to be intense. Because no one wants to feel like their professional life depends on ritual rather than necessity. That is why this debate became moral so quickly. People defended the office as though they were defending civilization itself, but often they were defending something more personal, their own legitimacy inside a structure that suddenly looked less convincing at distance. The real lesson is not that every coordinator, manager, strategist, or office worker is useless. That would be shallow. But remote work revealed something many institutions preferred to hide. There is a difference between work that directly changes reality and work that mainly sustains organizational self-reference. And once that distinction becomes visible, people start asking much sharper questions. How many layers are actually necessary? How much supervision improves output? And how much merely performs control? How much communication creates clarity, and how much exists to reassure hierarchy? The office stops looking purely like a place where work happens. It starts looking partly like a machine for legitimizing certain kinds of work that depend on being seen more than being measured. Maybe that is why the remote work debate became so intense. It was never only about productivity. It was about exposure. Exposure of weak management. Exposure of unnecessary rituals. Exposure of jobs built around visibility rather than clear value. Exposure of how much office life had trained people to confuse activity with importance. So no, remote work did not prove that all office jobs are fake, but it did expose how many parts of modern work were protected by the environment of the office itself. And once that protection disappeared, a lot of people saw something they could not unsee. It did not just move work home. It stripped away the stage and forced organizations to confront what was actually being produced once the theater ended.